there's been some brilliant moments of publicity over the weeks leading up to Interchange. And actually, we had yet another great lead-in from Anne onto the subject that I'm going to talk about just now. And I'm going to look at the nature of integrated transport in its truest sense, including both all transport modes and integration of space as well. So, talking about publicity, I think Paul and Andrew, the organisers of this conference, as well as doing all of their own work, did a fantastic job of coordinating the government into making a major transport announcement yesterday, which may not have been everything quite that we hoped for, but it was certainly a great trailblazer for this conference. And also, on a slightly broader-based note, it was interesting to see the government talk about brownfield development back on the 13th of February as well, which again may not have been everything that everybody would have hoped, but it was certainly a significant raising of the question of how you design in cities up the agenda. But various people quite rightly pointed out that it wasn't clear what this meant from a transport infrastructure point of view, nor really what it meant from a community's point of view. So, Interchange. The clue is in the name. What we're here to talk about is transport and travel, transport and people, and by extension, transport and space, and land use and transport. And these topics have cropped up again and again in connection with each other over the course of just the conversations we've had this morning. And again, with Anne bringing together the notion of everybody working together in a multidisciplinary format is very significant. And this conference is a unique opportunity to allow us all to think together in that way. And it's important, of course, because there are some significant concerns. We have to deal with climate change. And I think there's an acceptance, and it's come up, and it was talked about again this morning, about the connection between the emissions that come through transport and carbon reduction. But not only that, the emissions that come through everyday life and the importance of configuring our way of living so that it uses transport in an optimal way. It cultivates a way of life that allows us to reduce our carbon emissions. But there's also the housing shortage and general pressure on development. There's the issue of wealth and ensuring that we continue to grow an economy so that people feel satisfied with their lot in life. And there's also actually something which I think is remarkably under-discussed in the UK is quality of life full stop. And what should the vision be for better quality of life? So starting with integrated transport that includes those things of people and transport, space and transport working together, let's look at the modes first. So it's terrifically important that we are able to work not just at a regional level, which we've seen some really good examples of today, but also more at a national level to tie all of our modes together. The ultimate aim being to facilitate more, better modes of travel from an environmental point of view, but also to provide more flexibility so people have more choice to select the way in which they choose to travel. And as chairman of the British Aviation Group, there is a particular soapbox that I have to get on here, or I like to get on, to do with the consideration of all modes. So air transport as part of an integrated transport policy is key, because we know that aviation will always in the future be a carbon emitter. It's very, very difficult to travel the kinds of distances that you can with aviation and have a zero-emission aircraft. It's probably almost impossible. But there is an undoubted benefit that comes with air travel as well, and that's recognized by the millions of people who travel every year. So we have to find a balance within society that enables people to travel when they should do, to use some carbon when they should do, but that fits within a framework of transportation working together that promotes the best possible solution for travel and for the economy and for the environment. We also need to think about an integrated transportation policy to deal with the future. And as Paul was just mentioning now, the future is coming perhaps a bit more quickly than we anticipate. And if we don't have a framework for working in place, then we will be led by the nose. The tail will wag the dog, rather than being able to use new technology, new modes of transport like self-guided cars, like eVTOL, to benefit cities, benefit society, rather than being pulled around in different directions. So being able to cope with the disruptive factor that comes with new technology is key. And we can only do that in an integrated, holistic fashion. And then space and transport integrated. There's been a fantastic lobbying voice that's come from the Chancellor Institute of Highways and Transport over the last few years, which has advocated pulling together modes of transport and space considered together. On the left-hand side, and this is the first of my recommended readings to you today, 2017, Better Planning, Better Transport, Better Places was their first invitation to government and to the industry to work together in a broader-based sense. In 2022, they published a document that was called Fixing a Failing Planning and Transport System. So it's a little bit more demanding, because clearly things hadn't been going quite as well as they hoped with the original invitation. Do read it. The emphasis that it puts on the necessity to develop transport system and place at the same time in an integrated fashion is really quite insightful. So there is a bit of history here, thinking about the way in which land use and space develops hand in hand with transportation has quite a bit of background to it. In the 19th century, there was a degree of resistance, I think, in town planning in the UK, specifically, to industrial development and the transport systems that went with it. And that gave rise, through Morris and then eventually to Ebenezer Howard, to the Garden City movement via Geddes, which was an attempt to look at city planning as a means of controlling or a means of reacting to the perceived externalities of industrial development. That perception flipped, and if you look at the work of somebody like H.G. Wells at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a notion that the use of technology and the development of industry, and as it applied to transport, could be used as a way to develop cities and society. And through the massive progress of the 20th century, we of course found ourselves in a situation where certain modes of system thinking and centralized planning began to dominate. And that thinking also began to dominate the way in which our spaces were used and our spaces were shaped. And I think, I don't need to talk a great deal about some of the drawbacks of modernist thinking, but clearly it was underpinned by a notion that the space that was created would be a consequence of the way in which travel was planned and industrial systems were planned. And then we move into a late 20th century era. Particularly in this country, there's a fallback into a different way of thinking. You have a larger reliance on private sector development. You have a shying away from centralized planning. You have forms and appearance and modes which are perhaps more retrospective in their references and their thinking. And we've moved away, in many ways, from a vision of settlements and communities that respond to a transport system that supplies them. Because, of course, of the rise of the autocar, of the car and auto planning, it to a certain extent has facilitated a more diffuse and a less visionary thinking with regard to the connection between transportation and space. And yet, somewhere in this rejection of centralized planning, we've also lost touch with the relationship between transport and space, transport and people, and perhaps not at a professional level, but certainly in the public and political discourse. There is a lack of understanding and a vision of the quality of life that communities should and could have, and the components that are needed to build that quality of life in the public sphere. And there's a bit of a fear, I think, of how this should be paid for, how it might be managed, and will a better quality of life come with an economic penalty? So there's various fears, I think, in this country that we have to address. So let me just give you a quick example. This is my dad, and he lives in the south of England. And he has for a 75-year-old, he has a very busy family life. So he looks after 3 grandchildren. Their parents, my stepbrother and sister, they live over the other side of town. They live in a place where the schools are good, the schools are desirable, but there's no affordable housing, there's nowhere to work. So like a lot of people in this country, they are driving every morning, they're dropping the kids off, they're picking the kids up. The grandparents are driving the kids around, they're dropping them off, they're picking them up. And that would be fine, except the traffic is a living nightmare. It's awful. There's nothing that makes my family more stressed than not being able to get around on the on the road system. And I think it's a very, very common problem. But if you to ask my dad what he perceives to be the main problem in his community, he would tell you, and this is no lie, he would tell you it's people cycling on the pavements. And he said he believes this, and he will actually stop 13-year-olds and attempt to give them a lecture on common law of the 20th century in order to tell them why they're in the wrong. And I think it's this kind of confusion between symptom and cause that is actually very common in our country at the moment and in public discourse in this country. So, what is the problem? I think it's not unusual for people to hold more than one logical construct in their heads, conflicting logical construct in their heads. And it's not easy for them to necessarily perceive the connection between space, transport, and life, particularly with spatial concepts. As an architect, I talk to people about space all the time. Spatial concepts are quite hard to convey. And what's really missing here is a vision of how you tie these things together in this country. I think that everybody in the room has a sense of that, but the communicating of it to the broader community is something that still needs to be achieved. So what do people perceive? Like most people, my dad doesn't perceive the time and wealth and lifestyle benefits that could be unlocked through coordinated space and land use planning. What is lacking is a vision. And I've put up here is a picture of the 15-minute city. And the 15-minute city, for those of you that don't know it, the 15-minute city concept is a very, very good way of describing what you could achieve by having the correct community facilities in the right position and the right level of accessibility to what lies beyond your community, to enable you to have a life which deals with the local things in a way that's acceptable and deals with the beyond local things in a way that's acceptable as well. Now, we've seen some of the influence of the 15-minute city come into the UK, particularly post-pandemic, but I think there's been a difficulty in being able to reconcile what that concept could mean to how people actually live their life today. And let's remember that most people in this country don't live in the big urban centres, they actually live in suburban or country centres as well. So there's a lacking connection between the concept of something like the 15-minute city, which seems to be quite European, quite continental, versus how people actually live their lives here today. But we have to find ways of joining it together. And I think that it is still very important when we're looking for a solution and a vision that works for the UK to make sure that we don't lose touch with what's happening overseas. So this is my second reading recommendation, Planning the Mobile Metropolis by Luca Bertoloni. He writes very eloquently, again, about the relationship between space and transport, but he writes it from the perspective of a continental framework which is already planning this kind of integrated thinking now. And it has to be said that thinking in the UK is quite a long way ahead of where we are in this country. You have what's slightly unattractively called in Europe the Sustainable Urban Cities Framework, SUGS, SUBS, I think it is, in the European Union. And you also have a number of tools, planning tools in Europe, this is GOAT here, which allow you to look at the impact of making changes and combining data of cities, infrastructure, and transport together if you've got the funding in order to invest in bringing the tool up together. So when we put our vision together in this room about how this country should work, we also need to look overseas. And I know it's difficult post-Brexit, but there are certain areas where those connections still exist. So the fires of collaboration are still burning in academia, and there's perhaps an opportunity at this conference next year, and I don't know where Paul is, to also have some external, ex-UK influences to come and talk at the conference as well. So the vision is all about best practice. It's all about combining what everybody thinks ought to happen in this room and making it happen. But most importantly, it's about it's about picking up the theme as transport as an opportunity to enhance people's lives, but thinking about transport, accessibility, space, land use, and opportunity together to enhance people's lives. Something that's intrinsically understood by all of you, but it's up to you to form a vision and to tell it to the people who can spread the word, to the media, I suppose. And also to tell the people who can spread the word, to tell it to the people who can make a difference and make the decisions. Thank you very much for your time, and I wish you a good conference.